Hi y'all, and welcome back to the channel. Some of you know that I recently finished my master's thesis, which I wrote on Lord Dunmore's War. This is the last Indian War of the colonial period, and some historians like to act as if it was just kind of this like blip on the radar, didn't really matter, didn't really have any long-term ramifications. The rest of historians, for the most part, just ignore that it existed at all. And clearly, I don't really agree with either of those groups since I chose to devote so much time and effort to it. But that's kind of the reality behind this topic. I grew up in an area of Virginia that was affected by this, where men went and fought in this. And all around me growing up, I mean, we'd have like schools named after some of these guys, but nobody knows anything about the war or anything related to it. So this is something that I really wanted to learn more about, and because there's so little out there, I really wanted to share it with you guys. Now, of course, my master's thesis, it will be available online just like any other thesis or doctoral dissertation, but I imagine most people don't want to sit there and read this, 80 or 90 page thesis that's written in kind of like an academic tone that is very different from what I use in my videos. So I wanted to turn this into a video series as well so that there would be another avenue for that information to get out. And maybe just make it a little bit more accessible for everybody, because like I said, there's a few things that just the information isn't out there, and I would like to see that change. So let's get to it. I'm going to break this up over a number of videos so that it's not too much in one go. I know part of it can get rather heavy, so, we don't need to sit and just endure that all at once. Now, the major battle of Dunmore's War is called the Battle of Point Pleasant. And there have been West Virginian historians who have asserted that this is the first battle of the American Revolution. It's really kind of a tricky thing because there's some overlap in the reasons behind both wars, but it's definitely not the exact same altercation, which you will come to understand as we get into that. And I did a video a year ago on the Battle of Point Pleasant, and that video, it was based on what I had read from other historians. The kind of basic research that I'd done at the beginning the first time I encountered this topic, which was for a different research paper. So it was like, it seemed like I kind of had a good basis for what was going on there. But then when I got into the thesis itself and I got more into the primary source materials and reading their letters and reading reports that were written to London and all of this, I realized that a lot of what has been written about it is junk. So at this point, I just kind of, if this is what the historians have published, I just kind of like chucked it all. So this series will be written from a very different perspective just because I know a lot more now. And there's some key things that I think we really need to focus on and put out there. But keep in mind, this is going on in 1774. This is going on right as the American Revolution is about to gear up. Battle of Point Pleasant is 6 months before the battles of Lexington and Concord. So a lot going on at the same time. But Point Pleasant is by no means the only battle. I will get to that. First of all, let's talk about, what lit the fuse? What caused this Indian War? Especially if the colonists, they're upset about tea and all this other stuff and they're about to fight a revolution. Why would they get involved in another war over here on the frontier? And if you read some of the various histories that have been written about this, for example, Wither's Chronicles of Border Warfare, you see a number of skirmishes, for lack of a better word, that took place in 1774. And by skirmishes, I mean, it's a small group of white people, a small group of American Indians, differing tribes depending on what skirmish we're talking about. And, they clashed. But the thing is, that happened along the frontier. That this is not unique to 1774. This was a way of life at this point. This is something that's discussed by Captain John Stewart in his memoirs. He's one of the officers who was at Point Pleasant. He talks about how this is just the norm for the frontier. Everyone is used to it. That's how life is. So what makes these events of 1774 different? Why would this lead to war when nothing ever did before? And some authors like to reference Daniel Boone or the Yellow Creek Massacre. And when it comes to Boone, I don't think it has anything to do with this, really, but it comes up enough that I did cover it in my thesis. I'm going to cover it in one of the videos here because I just want us to kind of be clear and understand why some things affected this and why some things I would say did not. Now, there is so much that we can say about whether Europeans should even have been in this area, whether they should have been settling along the frontier, things we could say about the word frontier itself, because that term is loaded, although I do continue to use it here just because it refers to a geographical area that most people will understand, and I'm trying not to throw out that many new terms and just confuse everybody. But all that said, I think to understand what laid the groundwork for Dunmore's War, I think we can start around 1731 to get a sense of what happened. Because in 1731, James Logan, the provincial secretary of Pennsylvania, actually, he wrote to the Board of Trade and he asked that they, quote, encourage the government of Virginia to extend their settlements beyond the mountains, end quote. Now, why would a secretary of Pennsylvania care what Virginia is doing? And the answer is because it was a good way of protecting Great Britain's claims in North America. Because the French, they were up in Canada, they were down in Louisiana, they were up and down the Mississippi, and they were on excellent terms with a lot of American Indian tribes. So if Virginia, which was, quite large and strong and established at this point, if they didn't move westward and keep asserting, British dominion in North America, then that would leave it open for the French to move east from the Mississippi and do that same exact thing just before Britain could do it. So Logan really wanted to see Virginia really stake a claim to more land and more than just words. They wanted to send actual settlers there. And who better than poor immigrants who in some cases are essentially refugees who don't have a better place to go. Nobody really cares what happens to them. So let's send them to this frontier and let them just become a barrier against the enemy for us. And then there's a number of treaties that take place. And we have in 1744, we have the Treaty of Lancaster, where the Haudenosaunee ceded, quote, all the land in the said colony of Virginia, end quote. Now, where is the said colony of Virginia? I highly doubt the Haudenosaunee really knew what that would involve. I mean, at that point, Great Britain didn't even know how big North America was. I mean, they envisioned Virginia going all the way from the East Coast to the West. So clearly, nobody knows what's actually being ceded. Then in the Treaty of Lochaber, which was in 1752, the Shawnee, Lenape, and Haudenosaunee are said to have ceded, quote, the southern or eastern parts of the River Ohio, called otherwise the Allegheny, end quote. So as far as the colonists are concerned, their presence here is validated. They think it's okay. They have permission from whoever they thought they needed permission from. They think it's good. There's two major problems here. First, the Haudenosaunee, otherwise known as the Iroquois or the Six Nations, they didn't necessarily speak for all the tribes they like to claim that they spoke for. Just because the Shawnee and the Lenape were present during these discussions, that doesn't mean they agreed. And a lot of the time, it's their land that's being discussed. This goes back to the Covenant chain, which is also connected to Pennsylvania, where the English basically found that it was a lot more expedient to just have to negotiate with one tribe. So they would consider the Haudenosaunee as, the ones who speak on behalf of everybody else. They'd make their agreements with the Haudenosaunee, and then they just expect the other tribes to fall in line. And expect the Haudenosaunee to enforce these treaties if the other tribes failed to do so. The second problem, which even the British government in London brought up a number of times, was that a lot of these treaties were just exceptionally vague. Like, what I said with the said colony of Virginia. Where is that? So there were cases where even the British government would reject a new treaty line because they're like, well, this is too vague. This doesn't tell us anything. But one way or the other, you have very often American Indian tribes with one idea of where boundaries are, the British government with another idea of where boundary lines are, and then the colonists themselves having a completely different idea in their head of this is where the boundary line is. And that creates confusion that didn't help anybody. Then the French and Indian War arrived. Some Virginia colonists along, that frontier area we're talking about, the Shenandoah Valley and further south on the New River, some of them chose to stay despite the increasing danger. Some fled east to somewhere that was safer. But at the end of the war, France ceded most of their claims to North America to Great Britain. And of course, when we're talking about what these European superpowers are doing, that doesn't, again, mean that the American Indians agreed to this. I mean, this is a claim that's really in word only. But as far as Britain is concerned at this point, there is no more danger of the French moving into their territory. So that big reason that they wanted the poor immigrants to fill that gap, now all of a sudden that's not convenient anymore. They don't need that. And what's worse is it's a diplomatic problem between them and the American Indians because, well, first of all, the French and Indian War was extremely expensive. They had a lot of war debt after that. And then there was Pontiac's War, like right there at the end of the French and Indian War. So now the powers that be in London, they're like, we can't afford anymore. We don't care if it's intercontinental with another European power. We don't care if it's the Indian War. Whatever it is, we don't want it. We don't want to deal with it because we can't afford it. So this is when they put in place the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and that proclamation line. Not going to completely rehash that because I already have a video on it, which I will link right up here. But, that was kind of their motivation for it. That's where it fits in with this puzzle. And so now you have all this going on and London thinks, okay, well, everything's better now because we're just going to keep everybody happy for right now. And that's that. So the question wasn't really, would there be future treaties to change this boundary line? It was a question of when. And that came 5 years later in 1768 with the Treaties of Fort Stanwix and the Treaty of Hard Labor. Now, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix was negotiated by Sir William Johnson of the Northern Indian Department, and the Treaty of Hard Labor was negotiated by Captain John Stewart of the Southern Indian Department. So these are two men who each have kind of their marching orders from London, and they are supposed to negotiate these two lines that meet up in Virginia. Now, at Fort Stanwix, Johnson later reports to London that the Haudenosaunee insisted that they wanted to give extra land, that they had the right, and that they were offended by the idea that they didn't have the right to give this extra land. And poor Johnson, he just had no choice but to accept this extra land. If you know any sarcasm in how I'm saying that, that's intentional, right? Johnson didn't do his job. So the resulting Treaty of Fort Stanwix went down the Ohio River, past the Kanawha River, which is where it was supposed to stop, and included the land of, essentially Kentucky territory, which was not supposed to be part of this land cession. And then we had John Stewart in the south, a different one than the one that's going to be at Point Pleasant that we'll talk about separately. But Stewart down in the south, he followed his marching orders. He got the line to go to Chiswell's lead mines in Virginia and up the New River to the Kanawha River where it was supposed to meet Johnson's line, and Johnson just didn't come through. So now we have these problems with completely conflicting lines. Go figure. And the Board of Trade eventually recommends that there be a renegotiation, and this becomes the 1770 Treaty of Lochaber. And John Stewart essentially cleans up Johnson's mess by getting additional cessions from the Cherokee to try to make these lines intersect. The problem was to get additional land from the Cherokee, that was going to cost more money. So then London asked Virginia to pony up the difference there, give that extra money to make this renegotiation work, which Virginia did. And of course, then the British government's going to turn around and be like, oh yeah, we're still not giving you land grants. Your settlers, they still can't have the land. Well, but we paid for it. Yeah, but we don't care. You're not getting it. Meanwhile, the Shawnee, they're making their objections known as well because they didn't agree to this. This is their hunting ground. This is their land, and they didn't agree to give that up. And when they speak up, Johnson, he then writes to London, and he's basically saying, well, they don't have any right of soil, is the words he uses. So he just dismisses their claims to try to get London to overlook it. And around this time, we see historians talk about a confederacy that the Shawnee attempted to put together. They tried to make peace with some neighboring tribes so they could get this confederacy to go against the British colonies. For a couple reasons, that didn't pan out, and it's debatable which reason was the main thing that stopped it. But whether it was just divisions within the Shawnee themselves, some of them were more militant, some of them were more, peaceful, or, some say there's a couple articles that argue that the British Indian Department, men like Johnson and Stewart, they intervened and stopped this. But whatever the case, there was no confederacy that attacked the colonies. So if we're going to talk about the causes of Dunmore's War, this isn't one of them. The Shawnee did not go on the war path, contrary to what Dunmore later wanted to claim. So that leaves us asking the question, now that we have all this background information, what was it that lit the fuse, that caused the war? What happened? And I'm going to do that in the next video. I will talk about Daniel Boone. I will talk about the Yellow Creek Massacre. If you find this interesting so far, please hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already so that YouTube lets you know when the next videos are up. And I would love to hear your comments below. So thanks y'all, and I will see you in the next one.